deep, very serious.
Thank you for coming today. My first act is like Margaret Thatcher. I'm putting my bag here. It's like the gun in the first act. You have to look at it, and then you'll see why. It has a reason here in this presentation. I think my presentation connects very well with the two other presentations we had today in this session. I think it started really when I bought this bag, that I bumped into a phenomenon of multiple eyes. And this is how I started to research and go into it. So I'm also talking about Takashi Murakami, but in a different way, and about 4 other artists. So one of the elements of Takashi Murakami's super flat perception was the entrance to or reading of the artwork from all directions. Researchers link the creation of a composition that allows this multi-channel view to be influenced by the prints of ukiyo-e artists or by canonical artists such as Ito Jakchu from the 18th century. But it is also interesting to note the connection to the otaku company. In my lecture, I would like to examine the matter of the gaze, the shape of the eyes, the multiplicity of the eyes, not only as formalistic elements in works of art, but also as conceptual reflections on the postmodern spirit. So for this reason, I took the words of theorist Hiroki Azuma, who chooses to mention 2 relevant philosophers from the West that are connected to this postmodern spirit. So he took Jean-François Lyotard, who explained that the grand narratives that united the whole system of knowledge disappeared and that society was dismantled into small narratives of cultural communities. He put the emphasis on social and political change. And then he brings also Jean Baudrillard, who argued that modern distinction between original and the copy, the real and the image, has long been lost, and that everything became a simulacra in the postmodern era. And his approach was more towards the cultural and aesthetic reflection. These 2 arguments are supported by the same intuition. In the postmodern standard, we lose step by step the value of depth, the value of what we see behind the visuals which we encounter in everyday life. This looks just like, this is a sketch, but it's real. I mean, there's a real train covered with those eyes by Tadanori Yoku. The postmodern theorists argue that the works of the period are not created from an idea, not by authorship or by ideology, but by deconstruction and restructuring of the previous works, or by rereading them in a different manner, rather than creating or delivering a story. Accumulation of fragments from the deconstruction process has become an anonymous database from which new works are created, such as in techno music, that you take different fragments from different sources. The simulacra is the upper on-the-surface layer, which is provided and controlled by its underlayer, the database. The otaku culture is based upon the simulacra layer, which is visible and exposed, and the database layer, which is concealed. They decompose and recreate their images through search engines, moving between the 2. One visual expression to search engines can be the layer adorned with multi-eyes, leading from one layer to the other. I will just say that I corresponded with Taiyo Kimura about those images, and one interesting comment that I can say that these eyes are actually dug into, he takes a journal, a magazine, it's a cosmetic magazine, and he digs them in and he puts the eyes, inserts those eyes, And the upper image is from a fashion magazine. So I guess the simulacra is very strong in that sense as well. The otaku culture is based upon the simulacra layer, which is, okay, sorry, this is, I told you. The database is practically composed from elements of seduction that inspire the otaku. On the one hand, they are addicted to simulacra, but on the other hand, they are aware of the database. They love a certain figure, but also love to disassemble and reassemble it in a different way. Azuma highlights this difference in perception between the West and Japan by bringing the example of the ambassadors painted by Hans Holbein in the 16th century. In the work, there are two types of spaces, one on top of the other. One with a classical perspective, with a direct view into the picture. The other, an anamorphosis space, with a sideways view and a diagonal look. Jacques Lacan relates to the existence of these two spaces as side by side. Azuma states that the European perspective is artificial. It unites the entire space of the picture, giving up other possible gazes like the one of anamorphosis that you see below, which would enable more than one condensed point of view at the ambassadors. Lacan claims that each artificial system has its flaws, and in the case of Holbein's paintings, it is brought as anamorphosis. Therefore, the image described in anamorphosis is the skull, and the skull is eyeless. He can relate to the ambassadors who in turn, we can relate to the ambassadors who in turn treat us with their gaze only if we negate all other possible ways of looking. From this perspective, one might presume that Murakami expresses another option, embracing postmodernity. His painting is completely perspectiveless, but has many eyes. However, they are different from Holbein's since they do not stare back at the viewer. Murakami represents the postmodern structure covered with many holes to the database after the absolute modern perspective has lost its weight. We are not confronted with the author's recurring gaze, but by an anonymous database. The super of the superflat notion is the database, it's the depth of the database, and the flatness is represented by the simulacra. Azuma emphasizes that it is a postmodern depth and characterizes the superflat as a typical postmodern feature. Otaku have a strong affinity to eyes. The way the eyes are described is key to the success of the figure in the market because it explains the otaku approach to the database. Okada Toshio formulated a theory on how otaku thinks of eyes, dividing them into three types. Iki, an eye that identifies personal taste and style. Tsu is the expert's eye, understanding the mechanism behind the scenes of the production. Takumi, the intelligent and skilled eye, which analyzes the work theoretically, like a scientist, and sees beyond the structure, while understanding the work in depth to steal the idea and know how to perform it. Therefore, Okada refers to consumption as production. This is a piece 90 meters long that is in Brisbane in Australia. The otaku do not seek originality or autonomy in anime, but rather a variation within a singular worldview. Matsumi Midori uses the word micropop to conceptualize the phenomenon and to point out the criticism and protest it produces towards the political and social apparatus. So she takes two notions for that. One is a deterritorialization, the accumulation and aggregation of fragments from various sources of information in order to create personal interpretations and modes of actions that do not rely on the one dominant ideology. The second notion is reuse action, the inventions of new games and situations that encourage flexible public communication and spontaneous actions. Both systems see marginal populations, amateurs, anonymous people as groups with different degrees of freedom by distorting the standard codes imposed by the dominant culture. These theories, developed by Deleuze and Guattari and by Michel de Certeau, emphasize the paradoxical achievement of people who are oppressed because they are unfamiliar with the standard knowledge of the official language and culture, and therefore they turn to their imagination to create new languages and ways of effective actions by distorting the origins, the sources from which they took. Deleuze, Guattari, and de Certeau suggest thinking and acting as if we were strangers in our own culture. And this is something that Nara Yoshitomo usually says when he's interviewed and he talks about. He even said that he went to Germany and he lived there for so many years to be even more estranged and to be in a place that he also talks about loneliness. According to Deleuze and Guattari, the position of the individual as a free agent of his or her thoughts, which decipher in a novel way the language of the oppressors, represent the position of pop written with a small p. A characteristic that can be identified in almost all the examples brought here by Tadanori Yoku, Taiyo Kimura, Takashi Murakami, Nara Yoshitomo, and Yayoi Kusama. Azuma connects the flatness that appears in the work of Takashi Murakami and that which characterizes the interests of the otaku. Little Boy Catalog, that was just mentioned here, the third exhibition of the trilogy of Superflat, included for the first time articles which examined otaku as a protest force and a cultural component. They adopted the apocalypse as their shared obsession, which was just seen before, and manga as their private language. The artworks presented here inspect the phenomenon of the eyes from a modest number to plural, turning into a pattern. One of Murakami's gods of art, as he calls them, his name is Oval, was born from a request by fashion designer Issey Miyake to create a Japanese version of Humpty Dumpty. Murakami, inspired by the big head of the creatures in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, has added eyes so that the figure rolled into the image of a hovering Buddha who sees all. The floating version that Murakami created in 2001 in New York gave concrete validity to Yukio E's floating world, but the additional inspiration came from a Doraemon commercial that Murakami saw as a promotion to the book in Tokyo. The balloon, this is the installation. The balloon looks like a Buddha in meditation on the one hand and a spy balloon watching the viewer on the other. As Hannah Arendt speaks of the ambiguity of hope and annihilation by launching a satellite versus the first atom bomb. The images reflect a child's nonlinear perception, the simultaneity of involvement and disengagement, a sense of connection with the image on the one hand and the general appearance from an outer space that flattens everything. It works on the same logic of a child who naturally flows between reality and imagination. Midori Matsui writes that Murakami wants to tie the Buddhist approach to the one of the otaku, going between the simulacra layer and the database. She adopts the description of the Buddhist way from the poet Kenji Miyazawa, who phrased it as to contemplate simultaneously from the perspective of an insect and that of the Buddha, from a point of view of a crab at the bottom of the river and an imaginary eye hovering in the sky. These are painterly influences outside the representation of modern logic as depicted in Nara Yoshitomo's work with a multitude of floating heads. Figures and stars of different dimensions located in a not defined space that lack a center and disconnects from our notion of time. Alexandra Monroe describes the feeling towards these works in the Little Boy catalog as presented on an indiscriminately weightless platform of horror with cuteness. One of the theoreticians of manga and anime, Otsuka Eiji, speaks of the gaze through similar values from the kabuki theater. Sekai, which is a worldview, and shuko, which are variations. The first value is the repetition, and the second value is the difference. This difference gives the work its uniqueness. Murakami created quite a few works in which he has multiple eyes, not only in the entities he invented, but as a pattern on a square canvas. There is a piece called Jellyfish Eyes that grew up to be a wallpaper with a body color background. I think you can imagine what it is to eat and to see so many eyes looking at you. Another work worth mentioning here involves the high and low discourse. The work is called I Love Superflat, and it plays on the similar phonetic sound of I, myself, compared to I, a face feature. In the work in question, many eyes are painted, but among them is the logo of the well-known bag designer Louis Vuitton, that Renana Benit, my student here, is photographing now, showed me actually that this monogram was inspired and influenced by traditional Japanese family crests. They are creating a system of commodity between the consuming eyes and the consumed brand. The latter are colorful images without weight. The gaze, the eyes, the self, the subject, while in motion, is also limited within a well-organized, designed experience and the dictated consumption. A virtual look is led to elsewhere and elsewhen, as phrased by Anne Friedberg in her book, The Virtual Window. The gaze is placed side by side on the same surface with the goods that are supposed to be looked at. The observer becomes observed, the consumer is consumed. The color, size, and shape of the eyes are in similar relation to the Louis Vuitton monograms and form a regulated pattern with them. Jean-Ying Lee points to the paradoxical combination of individuality and consumer conformity that works on any screen. When such a paradox is formulated through a flattened visual field, the combination becomes an equation where its components can be exchanged. As in Murakami's work, where the panda is not only in the space where the Louis Vuitton monograms float, but also appear on its body. The animated character is not just the consumer of the brand, it is the brand itself. Substitute exchanges between identity and commodity. Murakami claims that his works lead the viewer's eyes in a mobilized gaze and dictate the pace of looking at the decentered subject on a flat surface, a concept that does not separate notions of space and time, but rather sees them as a unity. In both animation works, Superflat Monogram and Superflat First Love, one from 2003 and the other from 2009, there is a similar style and almost the same narrative. The film begins with a teenage girl standing in front of a Louis Vuitton shop, and in both films, she is swallowed up by Louis Vuitton's panda, the panda you saw before. Despite the menacing situation of being swallowed, she moves on a pleasant and cheerful journey, hovering in space, occupied by floating monograms of Louis Vuitton without a unifying perspective. The girl is balanced and the background is in movement, a direct influence from Osamu Tezuka's unique anime technique. The cheerfulness is in an ambivalent state because there is also a threatened, uncanny feeling. The girl is a buying power, a consumer, and a contemplative person. Although she seems to be liberated in a fantasy world, her body is often her body is often imprisoned in a flattened space within a certain frame, a door, a window, or a screen of a mobile, like you see here. These frames are virtual windows. Murakami is presenting a joyous yet menacing image. When we look into virtual windows like Google, YouTube, or Facebook, our gaze is freed from the strict reign for centuries of the Renaissance perspective, just to be caught into a century-old mechanism of the display window. So this is my last note. Thank you.